If you spend any time in cybersecurity communities online, you probably heard two completely opposite pieces of advice. Some people will tell you that you absolutely must have a home lab to break into the field. Others will say it's a complete waste of time. I've interviewed candidates with elaborate multi-server setups who couldn't explain what they actually learned. And I've interviewed people with a single virtual machine who demonstrated more practical understanding than folks with thousands of dollars of equipment. So the real question isn't whether you need a home lab. The question is whether building one will actually help you learn something that moves you forward. So the confusion is understandable, right? The confusion makes sense because unlike a certification which has clear requirements and a recognized name, there's no standard definition of what a home lab even is these days. For one person, it's a repurposed laptop running two virtual machines. For another person, it's a rack full of enterprise hardware in their closet, pulling enough electricity to heat a small room. The advice you get usually depends on who's giving it. Someone who learns by building things will insist a lab is essential because that's how they learned. Someone who came up through capture the flag competitions will tell you labs are optional because they found a different path. Both are describing genuine experience, but neither is describing a universal truth. So what do employers actually look for? So when I'm evaluating a candidate, I'm not checking boxes for specific equipment. I'm trying to answer a few critical questions. Can this person solve problems we actually face? Do they understand the concepts behind the tools, not just the commands? Can they explain their thinking to someone else? And will they be able to learn and adapt when things change? A home lab doesn't answer any of those questions by itself. Owning equipment or running a virtual machines tells me nothing about your capabilities. What matters is what you did with the environment, what you learned, and how clearly you can communicate that work. I've had plenty of candidates list a home lab on their resume. The conversation that follows tells me everything. Some can walk me through a specific problem they investigated. They explain why they chose certain tools, what went wrong, how they troubleshot it, and what they learned. Those candidates demonstrate real understanding regardless of whether the lab costs $50 or $5,000. Others struggle to explain what their lab actually does beyond listing the software they installed. They followed the tutorial, got everything working, and stopped. When I asked why they made certain choices or how they approach the same problem differently now, there's no answer. The lab exists, but the learning doesn't. I hire the first type of candidate. In that example, the difference has nothing to do with the lab itself. So usually, another thing I want to talk about, following instructions really isn't the same as solving problems. Building something by following a tutorial step by step teaches you to follow instructions, right? And there's some learning in there, but that has some value earlier on when you're learning basic mechanics, but it's not the same as solving problems. Real learning happens when something doesn't work the way you expected, when a configuration fails and you have to figure out why, when an attack doesn't behave the way or the way the guide said it would, and you need to investigate what's different. When you want to test whether a defense control actually stops a specific technique and you have to design your own experiment. That kind of learning produces skills that transfer to actual work. You develop troubleshooting instincts. You learn to read documentation critically. You start understanding how systems actually behave instead of how they're supposed to behave in theory. A lab that never breaks and never surprises you really isn't teaching you much. A lab where things go wrong and you have to figure out why is teaching you how to think. Kind of before all this, kind of start with a question. Before you spend time building a lab, ask yourself, what specific thing are you trying to learn? The more precise your goal, the more useful the project will be. A vague goal like learn penetration testing doesn't really give enough direction. You can spend weeks building infrastructure without developing any particular skill. A specific goal like understand how pass-the-hash attacks work and what evidence they leave in Windows event logs gives you something concrete to investigate. The best projects start with curiosity about something specific. Maybe you read about a technique and want to see it in action. Maybe you want to understand how a tool actually works. instead of just running it. When you start with a question, you only build what you need to answer it. You might discover you only need 2 virtual machines. You avoid building infrastructure for its own sake, and you create something that you can explain to someone else. I wanted to understand this, so I built this, and here's what I learned. That's a complete story that demonstrates, both your technical work and your thinking. That's what matters in an interview. You know, documentation matters, as much as the actual work itself. A line on your resume that says home lab tells an employer almost nothing. It's a claim without evidence. What actually demonstrates capability is documentation of what you did. Maybe that's a GitHub repository with write-ups of things you investigated. Maybe it's a blog where you explain problems you solved. Maybe it's detailed notes that you can reference when you're walking someone through a project in an interview. The documentation doesn't need to be elaborate, but it should be clear. Describe what you were trying to learn. Explain what you built and why. Discuss what worked, what didn't, and how you would troubleshoot problems. Reflect on what you learned and what you do differently. This serves 2 purposes. First, it gives you concrete material to discuss in interviews. Second, the process of writing forces you to think clearly about what you actually learned. If you can't explain a project in writing, you probably don't understand it well enough to defend it when someone asks you questions about it. I remember comparing 2 candidates for a security position who approached this very differently. And one had a really impressive lab setup, multiple servers, network equipment, several security tools. They had clearly spent, a lot of time and money building it. But when I asked them to walk me through something they had actually done with it, the conversation became difficult. They could tell me what tools they installed, but they couldn't clearly explain a problem they had investigated. Why they made a certain decision, or what they learned when something just didn't work. The other candidate had nothing close to that setup. Their projects were actually pretty simple, but they had documented them, right? They walked me through one project almost like a case study. And here's what I was trying to figure out. Here's what I built. Here's what I expected to happen. This part didn't work. Here's how I troubleshot it. And here's what I do differently next time. That candidate was much easier for me to evaluate because they gave me evidence of how they think. I don't care that the other person had more equipment. I'm not hiring the home lab itself, right? I'm hiring the person who has to solve the problems and communicate what they find. That's what I take a simple, well-documented project you actually understand over a $5,000 home lab you can't explain. So another twist to this is, maybe there's a part where the lab isn't the best use of your time. Building and maintaining a lab takes time and at least some resources. For most people, it's in some situation that investment doesn't make sense. If you're still building foundational knowledge, structured platforms might serve you better. Things like Try Hack Me or Hack the Box provide guided paths with hands-on exercises in environments that are actually configured. You can focus on learning instead of troubleshooting infrastructure. If you're working full-time trying to transition into the security field, you might get more value from focus study and certifications than from home projects. It depends on what gaps you need to fill and what will move you the closest to your next opportunity. If your learning style doesn't align with self-directed lab work, forcing yourself to build environments might just create frustration. Some people learn better through structured courses or collaborative projects. There's no virtue in choosing a method that doesn't work for you because other people recommend it. And so as far as alternatives that may work, if you want hands-on experience but building your own lab doesn't fit, there are good alternatives. Cloud-based platforms provide environments where you can practice without managing infrastructure. Many offer free tiers or low-cost subscriptions. You get access to vulnerable machines, defensive tools, and guided exercises. The infrastructure is handled for you. Capture the flag platforms provide structured challenges that teach specific concepts. You solve problems, document your approach, and move to the next challenge. Every single laptop running free software like VirtualBox can support real learning. You can run vulnerable VMs, practice techniques, test tools, and investigate how systems actually behave. The learning outcomes from what you do, not from what you spent. So, make a decision that fits your situation, right? There's no universal answer here because it just depends on, what you're trying to accomplish and how you learn the best. If you learn by building things and investigating how they work, a lab might be exactly the right tool for you. If you learn better through structured exercises, other paths might serve you better. What matters isn't whether you have a lab. What matters is whether you can demonstrate that you understand the concepts, right? Solve problems and communicate clearly. A well-used lab can help you develop those abilities. So, so can other approaches too. But before you invest time and money into a lab, get clear on what specific skills you want to develop. Ask whether a lab is the most effective way, given your situation. Consider what alternatives might accomplish the same goals, with less overhead. If you decide a lab makes sense, start small. Start with a question. Build only what you need to investigate something specific. Document what you learn. Very important. Practice explaining your work out loud. If a lab doesn't fit right now, choose something that does. Use cloud platforms. Work through challenges. Contribute to open source projects. The goal is learning and demonstration, not ownership of equipment. So as far as closing things out here, the candidates who succeed in breaking into cybersecurity aren't the ones with the most expensive equipment. They are the ones who can explain what they know, demonstrate how they solve problems, and communicate clearly to people making hiring decisions. A home lab can help you develop those abilities, but it's not the only path, and it's not a requirement. Make the choice that actually serves your learning instead of following advice that might not fit your situation. So if this was helpful, subscribe for more practical guidance on building a career in cybersecurity, and share your own experience in the comments. What's actually worked for you? The more we talk about what really helps instead of what we think we're supposed to do, the better we can help people find their own path. Subscribe for more of this every single week, and I'll see you in the next one.